Hello, this is a second teaser chapter that I'm releasing in support of my GoFundMe campaign for The Shorelines by David Baker. Chapter 2. San and Jilu. The bleak and silent darkness was suddenly interrupted by a voice. A quiet, frail, quivering voice, a half-whisper that rasped and gasped over its high tone. This was the voice of someone who clearly didn't speak aloud very often. "Mister, you alive? You breathe?" The timorous voice repeated the inquiry several times until Jilu managed to make sense of where he was again. The scales of his brush with death fell from his eyes, and he saw a young lad dressed in rotten rags before him. The rags looked almost burnt with filth, and were so frayed it resembled hair. He spoke in broken words, probably not his native tongue. With a heavy and urgent, breathy voice, he persisted in his inquiries. He smelled of the land, and his hands were swollen and bruised. Visible open wounds and sores littered his arms. 2 deep gashes carved their way into his wrists, and fresh blood seeped over the older brown stains. "I am San," he said. San of nothing. Announcing his meagre title didn't fill Jilu with confidence, but he was glad to hear a relatively friendly voice again. With the strength of a larger and healthier man, he turned the cart back on its wheels. It righted itself, and it fell with a crash back onto the roadside. Jilu once again bounced his bloodied head off the cart base and briefly returned to unconsciousness. San started to untie Jilu's bonds. He constantly glanced over his shoulder as he was worked with a look of fear in his eyes. Sceptical and very afraid that this was another betrayal from one of his own, Jilu planned his escape in his head, the second the last rope was cut from his now bleeding arms. Perhaps the pure adrenaline that flooded his veins could help muster the strength for a counter. He swung a feeble arm at San's face in a futile attempt at escape, but his dehydrated body, now bereft of energy, failed him, and he fell back down, his limp and broken body now signalling surrender to his possible new enemy. "What's your name?" San inquired. "Jilu," he replied in almost a whisper. "I give you water. You look dead." San produced a bladder full of stale water from his tattered bag. Jilu tried to drink, but immediately vomited. He coughed and sputtered, unaware of his crushed neck and bloodied lips. "No, friend, you must drink slow," said San. "Just pour it over your lips." Jilu did as instructed, and after a while he did feel a lot more alive. He looked up at San and realised he was just skin and bone. Perhaps another poor exiled bastard from Panna. How long had this man been out here in the wilderness to look this horrid? Jilu had never seen limbs so thin, just bone with thin layers of yellowed skin hanging from them. His rags were covered in old blood stains, and for the first time Jilu could finally smell the horrific odour from his saviour for the first time. "Oh, fuck!" Jilu gasped as he almost gagged on the shit-like smell that infiltrated his nostrils. San turned quickly like an animal hiding from a predator in the wild. It was then that Jilu observed his head, shaved, bruised and swollen as though he had been severely beaten. But more curiously, San appeared to be branded on the back of his bald skull with a scabby and pus-oozing letter, Q. Jilu immediately began to feel guilty for thinking he was any threat and sought to apologise. But before he could summon up the strength to speak, San bolted from his side. He made a frantic yet athletic dive into the brush and hid in a crevice where the horse had died. Jilu scrambled over to the crevice on his belly. He was so weak he almost gave up entirely. He grabbed the edge of the boggy crack where San dove and looked down to see if he was injured. What he saw was even more pathetic. At the bottom of the crevice, cuddled into the rump of the dead horse, San shivered and seemed to jump at any sound. He quietly sobbed to himself and continued to shake, the kind of reaction that comes from years of abuse and violence. Jilu knew these signs of submission and fear all too well. "San," Jilu called from above. "Down! Now! Here, please! Quick, quick!" San interrupted. A crunching sound not far away caught Jilu's ear, and he ducked down into the hole to join the now terrified San. In the distance, a group of large men were beating the long grass like hunters scaring up birds to shoot. In one hand they swung large poles, in the other they had flails of wood embedded with nails. What sort of hunt was this? Who was this frail escapee? What was his crime? Jilu knew little of the world outside Panna, but he knew there were farming settlements outside the walls, independent of the overseer and his guard's grasp. The one thing he could surmise is that the outside world was just as brutal as his own parochial prison. Jilu quickly decided that he owed his life to this apparent criminal, so he decided to hide with San. Behind the dead horse, now bloated, but with a smell more palatable than San's odour, he joined his new companion, where they lay in complete silence. After an hour or so, without a word between them, the sky opened up into a heavy rain shower. Rain that battered the clay earth into submission. Knowing this weather well, Jilu knew it was now safe to move and not leave clear tracks in the sticky clay soil. They made for a large outcrop of rock, beyond which opened into a vast flat plain that stretched into the horizon. They both ducked in unison whenever they heard distant sounds of beating in the grass. They moved covertly, almost squatting as they traversed the sodden ground. However, their stealthy escape was halted by something quite unexpected. Jilu felt something hard jolt his foot. "What the fuck is this?" he whispered, gesturing to the ground. At his feet lay masses of bones. First only a small scatter, then piles and piles of them. Broken swords and shattered shields also lay among the human detritus. Alarmed to say the least, Jilu asked again, "What happened in this place?" "A battle long ago," said San. "Maybe 50, 100 years ago. I don't think anyone knows for sure." Jilu looked down and saw a helmet containing a shattered skull. "How many souls are here and who were they?" Jilu asked. "Too many to count. Probably whole cities lie here. There are ruins, now empty for a long time, before me, before you. All dead." "You have a great talent for making me shit myself, you know, San," Jilu remarked. The plain stretched on, and so did the litter of bones. They finally stood in brutal awe of the piles of skulls stacked in their hundreds, like a mountain range of death and decay, stretching into the now dissipating mist that hung low over the plain. San suddenly dropped to the ground. He let out an abrupt cough like moan. Blood oozed from his head, and he lay motionless amongst the fragments of death all around him. Was he about to be the latest soul captured by this wilderness? Then Jilu felt a sharp pain in his back, then another to his arm. He slowly realised what had happened. About 50 yards away stood the same human hunters. Now they had changed their tactics. Using leather slings, they were firing stones from the boundary of the bone field. With each swing they shouted, "San, San, dead man." "Stay down, be dead," San whispered loudly. "They come into the battlefield. No, they afraid. They know what's here." Jilu felt another sharp hit to his chest, and he fell down supposedly dead. Just like before, the hidden silence among the long grass and the piles of bones. The stones continued to whip overhead and land with horrible cracking thuds as they struck the bones. The whistling barrage of shot continued for some time as the fleeing duo played dead. This was an apt place, after all, to play this role, Jilu thought to himself. A loud scream from the hunters in the distance. It was a screech of absolute terror and made the hairs on Jilu's neck stand to attention. The stone projectiles ceased flying overhead, and hurried footsteps could be heard. Then silence. Jilu didn't know what was going on, but saw San go as pale as snow. "What is it? What's wrong? Please tell me." Jilu cut short his inquiry as he looked at the ground where they were laying. The soil was soaked with blood. The grass blades seeped red like they were weeping. San shot up with the strength of a much healthier man and bolted in the same direction of his own potential captors. "Run, you fucking idiot, run!" shouted San. Jilu heard the immediacy and fear in his voice, obliged, and followed San until he stopped. Both breathless and drained, they turned to see where the fear originated. "Oh, if I shit myself, I fucking swear we're gonna fall out, San." Jilu clutched his chest containing his now pounding heart. Yet as he finally focused upon the plain, he saw it. A horror that Jilu would never forget. For as far as he could see, there were figures, not human. None of this world, certainly. Translucent spectres in armour, ghostly anonymous figures, missing limbs and heads. They moved silently, drifting from pile to pile, searching the discarded remains. Occasionally they found a bone and picked it up, dismissing them and throwing them into new piles, then moving on. "Okay, San, this time I won't blame you for shitting myself," said Jilu. San squatted down and beckoned Jilu to do the same as he observed this otherworldly spectacle. "These were once warriors, long ago. The cause of the battle, no one knows. Amount of them who died, no one could count. They roam this land looking for their lost body parts until they are complete again. Then they vanish as complete souls. Normally you cannot see them, but if an act of violence or pain takes place here, they rise up to defend their open mass grave. This is no ordinary battlefield. It's a necropolis with its own deceased caretakers." Another spectre silently wheeled by, and San continued. "Used to come here to hide, so I knew when to leave and where to tread. 'Cause I am slave, one of hundreds bought by farm, on the edge of the river. Most were worked to death, others murdered or hunted for sport." San wept as he finally told his story to someone for the first time. It must have been a blessed relief for him and a painful relief at the same time. "Who sold you to these scum?" inquired Jilu. With a tremulous voice, San replied, "The Khan." Jilu remembered the branding on the back of San's neck and sighed a heavy breath. He knew what it was like to be classless and worth nothing to others. He remembered the beatings and the back-breaking toil he carried out for the town of Panna, but he also knew they had a simply easier life than San. He tried not to pity the stick-thing man. Instead, he chose to admire his spirit. He made a pledge to himself that he and San would escape this place and be free. A brother in exile that could accompany him on his unknown path into the wild. But many questions flooded through his mind. Who was this mysterious and clearly malevolent Khan? Where would San lead him to get away from these oppressors? Were there more of his kind? Were they all wrecked in spirit and body? His brain ached, and all these new possibilities and dangers. "Oh shit, I would have been better off dead," he thought. They decided together that it was probably best now to only move at night. They sought shelter until dusk. Proceeding along the edges of the battlefield graveyard, they had found an upturned tree. A large pit where its roots had once been was a perfect resting spot for the night. As the rain returned for yet another deluge on the battlefield, they quickly moved into their temporary campsite. San, now believing himself safe with Jilu by his side, fell into a sound sleep. Curling up into an almost fetal position, he slept for hours. Jilu dutifully stood guard over his new companion till the sun set over the vast plain of death. Such a beautiful sunset he had never seen before. A blood-red glow held dominion in the sky, Silence crept over the land, apart from distant sounds of trickling water and buzzing fireflies. Jilu felt as though he were alone in the world, with this spectacle as a gift only for him. For the first time in his dour life, no walls obscured the obscene beauty of his first view of the death of an old day's light. Soon dusk took hold of the sky, and thousands of stars pierced the dark violet veil overhead. Jilu wept at the wonder he had seen for the first time. The tears were for once tears of joy. Maybe this was his new beginning, emancipated from toil and free of pain. "Beautiful, isn't it?" San whispered with one eye still closed. "We should move now and make for the other side of the plain. It'd take hours for us to reach the other side, but it is safer there." They set off into the twilight with gentle footsteps, carefully avoiding the bones out of respect to the dead. They covered good ground for about 2 hours in relative silence. Then San started to sing quietly. The words were in a tongue Jilu had never heard, perhaps his native tongue. The tune entered his mind, and he hummed along with San, who had looked so happy to share his song with someone else for once. "Now you sing, friend," said San in an almost begging cadence. "Where I'm from, there is little to sing about," Jilu replied, as he traversed yet more human remains. "Everyone has one song inside," said San, smiling. They walked for a few more minutes before Jilu broke his semi-embarrassed silence. Jilu sung the only chorus he knew from a song sung in hushed tones in the outer ward when someone had died. "For we weep, we cry, these tears for thee in our eyes. We know not our end, but hope it's swift and clean, my friend. Bonded by fate and outsider hate, but no more for you, our fallen comrade." Both stood for a second to reflect on the song of Jilu's past. "We must sing," said Can. "It is our freedom, peace inside the head." Jilu put his hand on San's shoulder in silent agreement. They carried on into the now calling dawn light, singing songs and smiling as they bonded by the melodies and lyrical eulogies to their past. As the first birds began their ode to a new day, they rested a while to watch the sun return to the sky, illuminating their carefully treaded path through the desolate wastes of the battlefield. On the horizon they saw vivid green grass and the start of a rolling hill. This was one of the most beautiful sights Jilu had ever seen. Lush grass and trees with little babbling brooks and streams. They knew they had passed beyond the grasp of their old foes and quickened their pace. Feeling the warmth of the morning sun on their backs and feeling like free men at last, they stepped off the plain into a lush green meadow. The smell of the wildflowers tickled Jilu's hungry nostrils. He let out the most satisfying sneeze any man had ever experienced. Birds flocked and landed in the trees, where San spotted a dark green fruit hanging in abundance. They harvested several specimens for their breakfast. San bit greedily into the fruit and swallowed its pulp with a hungry slurp. But just as Jilu was about to indulge, San groaned and started to violently vomit into the grass. The foul purple sludge he threw up started to steam, then smoke with a disgusting odour. It smelt like dead flesh. So pungent, Jilu gagged and inevitably lost control of his stomach as well. "What the fuck did you just eat?" he asked, but San began to shake and sweat profusely. San fell to the ground and convulsed violently. Screaming in pain, he exclaimed, "Fire! In my depths, fire!" The remaining fruit from which he had bitten now started to move on its own. Vile maggots sprung forth from its once ripe, fresh pulp. Was this poison or sorcery? Jilu spied a stream in the distance and ran to collect water for his infirmed friend. Quickly he sprinted, carrying San's water bladder to fill it up. He returned to find San talking to himself, muttering incoherently in his own language. "What can I do? San? Do you know what's going on? Can you hear me?" Jilu frantically asked again and again. "Fan! Take me to Fan!" shouted San in between fits. "Who is Fan?" replied Jilu. "Brother! Live along river here. Help! Medicine! He is medicine, man! Help! Help! Gilu looked east and saw a small plume of smoke coming from what looked like a valley about a quarter of a mile away. This looked like the only signs of settlement for miles. He slung San over his shoulder. Although he was just skin and bone, Gilu struggled. He struggled to carry him because of exhaustion from the last 2 days' journey. Stay with me, San. Stay awake, my friend. Sing me your song again. Sing me your song. He wanted him to stay conscious as long as possible. San began to weakly sing his unknown tune over and over, only stopping to vomit or grunt in agony. Gilu started to run as quickly as his weak legs could carry him, over a hill and down a steep wooded valley to a river at the bottom. On the banks of the river, he followed the smoke in the air, expecting to see a house or at least a campfire. He kept calling out for the name Fan in the morning air. More and more frantically he shouted for help until he came to a clearing on the bank. Here he saw the smouldering remnants of a tent. It looked like it had only set alight hours ago. Was this the elusive Fan's home? He stepped closer to search for a clue, but all he found was a giant letter Q burnt into the grass and a large pool of freshly spilled blood. What has happened? Q. He tapped San on the back to show him the scene. In the chaos he failed to notice the silence, a cold silence. No longer did San sing his song. He didn't know how long he'd been mute. Panicked, Gilu lay San down on the grass and looked in sickening terror at his face. Contorted and frozen into a look of pure fear, his mouth was dripping with putrid bloody gore. All his teeth were missing, and his eyes had turned to a frightening black colour. No white left in his gaze, just 2 cold, dark pools of emptiness stared back at Gilu. San grew cold quickly and stiffened into a rigid and crooked shape. Suddenly his body started to twitch and tremble for a moment. Gilu thought it was another form of fit. Probably in more hope than judgment, he thought he might pull through. Oh, until the belly erupted with a disgusting fountain of maggots that kept coming as though San's body was a never-ending nest. Oh, fuck, what is going on? He shouted. All Gilu could do was watch as his new friend seemed to relentlessly twitch into death. His eyes sunk into his shrunken face, his lips seemed to shrivel around his gums, then the maggots surged from his mouth to cover his entire face. The living ejection from the remnants of his lips made Gilu heave. His empty stomach ached as bile filled his mouth at this disgusting image. Within 10 minutes, San was nothing more than a freshly picked clean skeleton. He now lay gleaming white, a shell, under the dappled morning sun that filtered through the trees. The maggot colony seemed to just evaporate into the ether. Gilu kneeled next to the remains of San, uncontrollably crying in a peak of extraordinary, maddening sadness, the like of which he had never experienced before. Even in the darkest hours of the slums he never felt despair like this. He did not want to be alone again this soon. Gilu felt like the entire world had spun out of control and descended into madness, a nightmarish fever with little reason to guide his actions. It seemed like hours that he floated in this state of shock. Slowly his wits returned along with floods of bitter tears. He decided decency was the only option now. With a delicate but sickening touch, Gilu collected the bones of his only and fleeting former friend. He gathered and placed them in a piece of unburnt skin from the tent. A grave was needed for this man who saved his life and gave him joy for just one day. A relative stranger who had shared Gilu's first sunrise. Bringing the makeshift bag of bones to the edge of the river bank, he picked some driftwood from the water. He fashioned a tool to dig. In the soft river soil on the banks, he dug a hole and placed the remains inside, pausing only to weep yet more tears. He filled it in with his bare hands, now caked in soggy dark soil deposited by the river. He stood over the fresh grave. He had never felt so alone in the world. In tribute to his former rescuer and someone who he considered his friend, he sung his lament, that he had shared with San back on the battlefield. This seemed to be a lifetime ago, not just a day. He penned his own verse in tribute to his friend. For now I weep, I cry, these tears for thee in my eyes. I know your end, I lament at your graveside, my only friend. Bonded by fate and outsider hate, but no more for you, my fallen comrade.